Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha TV's special program, Agenda 2014. I am Krishnanand Tripathi. Perhaps the biggest issue in this general election is going to be the issue of price rise, or in technical terms, high inflation. High inflation has often tilted balance against incumbent governments. In this special report, Untamed Inflation, we are going to discuss the issue of price rise and why policymakers continue to fail to control rising prices.
November 2013, after 3 successive terms, the Sheila Dikshit government in Delhi is booted out. Just a week before, onions were retailing at 80 to 100 rupees a kilo in the national capital.
The onion crisis of last year. Now, onion prices at that time went all the way to 50 rupees a kg in the wholesale market. Today they are between 5 to 7 rupees a kg in the wholesale market.
Delhi was reeling from inflation. People were talking about price rise, things becoming more expensive than before, especially vegetables, milk, whatever item, eggs also.
For Dikshit, history was repeating itself. In 1998, she had herself come to power riding on high onion prices that signalled the end of the road for Sushma Swaraj.
Sheila Dikshit, I would say, a combination of two factors. There was an anti-incumbency. She was facing the anti-incumbency of the centre. She was also facing her own anti-incumbency of 3 terms. So, and inflation really broke her back.
Compared to other developing countries, India has always had modest inflation numbers. On an average, wholesale prices rose about 6.7% every year. In other words, prices went up 45 times in the last 62 years. This eroded the value of the rupee so heavily, in fact, that the value of 100 rupees in 1952 came down to just 2 rupees 10 paise in 2012. Since 2008-9, India is witnessing near double-digit inflation, mostly triggered by an unprecedented rise in food prices.
NDA period of 98 to 2003-5, food inflation was only 4%. Then in UPA 1, food inflation jumped to 6%, which was also bearable. But then UPA 2 period has been a major problem because that's when overall food inflation is above 10%.
Multiple policy interventions failed to improve the situation.
High inflation has been the inability of the policy makers to understand the impact of high growth phase.
On an average, an Indian household spends almost half of its budget on food items. Poor families spend even up to 60 to 70% of their incomes, which makes solving the inflation puzzle paramount for policy makers. A fact that the finance minister himself acknowledged while presenting the interim budget.
The government and the RBI have acted in tandem. While our efforts have not been in vain, there is still some distance to go. Food inflation is still the main worry, although it has declined sharply from a high of 13.6% to 6.2%.
From 2000 to 2007, global inflation averaged 3.9% per year. Even the traditional high inflation countries, the emerging and developing economies, had an average annual price rise of 6.7%. India, however, fared slightly better. Wholesale price index grew 5.2% annually, while the consumer price index grew at 4.6%.
Inflation rates were reasonably stable around 5 to 6% per annum. Which was perceived by policymakers and the public at large as well as normal until about 4 or 5 years ago.
All that changed in 2008 when prices soared up to 8.1% per year. The very next year, inflation fell to 3.8%, only to rise again. It touched double digits in 2010-12 and showed some moderation in 2012-13.
The normal has become something like, I'm talking about overall consumer price index, overall rates of inflation of somewhere between 8 to 10%.
India has vast experience in keeping its inflation within the comfort zone, which is why the persistence of the elevated inflation has puzzled many.
On the supply side, we are having one of the best harvests. The stocks are bulging with the government. And why then there is inflation? The only explanation is that there is too much money floating in the system.
In a vocal democracy like India, price rise inevitably leads to high decibel protests. Both in the 14th and 15th Lok Sabhas, the opposition initiated several debates in Parliament. Between 2009 and 2011, 110 MPs from 26 political parties took part in discussions on price rise that lasted 35 hours. In early 2010, wholesale food price index touched 11% when the left parties threatened nationwide protests. In February 2010, the Prime Minister met chief ministers to chalk out an anti-inflation strategy, but it failed to satisfy the opposition. The principal opposition party, the BJP, refused to accept the government's argument that high growth was causing inflation. Then Finance Minister Pranab Mukherjee argued that it was wrong to blame the government when it was doing everything to check inflation. The price rise issue continued to reverberate in Parliament.
In India, we are today in a situation when the price of need, onion, the price of petrol, convenience, and the price of luxury, beer, all is the same. Rupees 75 to 80, onion, petrol or beer.
Nowadays, even in the price of onions, we are paying global prices. We are paying $1.50 for an onion or a kg of onions.
But the politics aside, high inflation is a puzzle for policymakers. A complex interplay of structural and policy issues continues to be a huge challenge.
It's not just the seasonal factor which are driving food inflation, but it is also the structural factors. One of the structural factors I just hinted at is the changing consumption pattern of the people because the incomes have gone up.
In 2008, the world was engulfed by the worst recession ever. The Indian government responded with a huge stimulus program. The Reserve Bank supplemented the efforts with a loose monetary policy, pumping in liquidity to boost investment and consumption.
After the 2008 global financial crisis, the Western economies, especially the US, it pumped in massive liquidity. And all that liquidity, even Europe pumped in a lot of liquidity. All that money actually flows into the emerging markets.
There were other measures as well. The then Finance Minister Pranab Mukherjee cut excise duties from 12 to 8%.
When 2008 global economic crisis happened, the government put in place one after another 4 fiscal stimuli.
Between October 2008 and April 2009, the RBI reduced the repo rate, the rate at which banks borrow money from it, almost by half to 4.75%. The reverse repo rate, the rate at which banks park surplus funds with the RBI, was reduced by 275 basis points from 6 to 3.25%. The cash reserve ratio for banks was reduced by 400 basis points to 5%.
India had also given a huge fiscal stimulus, at least an extra maybe 2% of GDP, which came and especially came in the form of income transfer to people in Narega, in the form of pay commission payouts, in the form of farm loan waivers. So these actually also added to inflation.
India's stimulus measures were of course in line with what the major economies of the world were initiating. The US Congress pumped in $600 billion, the European Union injected 200 billion euros, China put in nearly $600 billion. The high rate of liquidity certainly speeded up the global turnaround, but it also brought fresh problems for a petroleum importing nation like India, a high crude import bill for one. With global crude prices galloping away, by 2012-13, India was spending over 5,30,000 crores dollars per year in importing petroleum products from abroad. That wasn't all. There was also a difference where India was directing its fiscal stimulus. For instance, China used it to create infrastructure, but India aimed it at increasing consumption. Most of the Indian stimulus went into farm loan waivers, the 6th pay commission payouts and wages through Manrega.
But when you pay out money without creating an asset, then it really adds to inflation. Nothing else happens because it doesn't add to growth.
Since 2000, total money supply was increasing at 17% per annum. Agriculture, on the other hand, was growing at just 2.7%. The GDP was around 7%. Clearly, a lot of money was chasing too few goods and services.
Loan waivers and expanding of Manrega, and these are all expenditure boosting factors. Now, when you are increasing demand, and in an economy where an average household still spends about 50% on food, the pressure was most on food.
However, some experts do not see a direct correlation between high deficit and high inflation.
Fiscal deficit and inflation, they have some link, but they do not always have a correlation. We have had periods of high fiscal deficit and low inflation also. That is between, say, 1998 and 2004.
Experts trace the origins of the current high inflation to the failure of the monsoon in 2009. That's when food inflation entered double digits.
The current bout of inflation is normally attributed to the monsoon failure of 2009. But if you really look at the food inflation, then one would realize that food inflation was almost close to double digit even before the monsoon had failed.
All these factors definitely had a role in pushing up inflation. After the break, we will analyze how Indian policymakers responded to the situation and its impact on Indian economy. Welcome back. Concerned over high inflation, India's central bank, the Reserve Bank of India, adopted a tight monetary policy as a tool to control inflation. But a tight money policy has a limited role in controlling food prices.
High global food prices also did their bit in contributing to the high inflation in India. Global food price index rose over 100% in the last 5 years. India's own food grain and food item price index witnessed a similar rise.
The World Food Price Index, which is measured by FAO, which was 100 in 2004-05, is today 210. Now, exactly the same scenario has happened in India. Our wholesale price index, which was 100 in 2004-05, also is 210 towards the end of 2013. Now, that means there is a convergence of domestic prices to global prices.
Between 2008 and 2012, agriculture wages rose by nearly 17% per year. This increased general wages across the sectors, with real wages growing by 6% annually.
That incomes have risen very significantly, which is the reason why poverty declined. Poverty declined by 138 million between 2004-05 and 2011-12, according to NSS data.
This was a time when the UPA's flagship rural employment program Manrega was also contributing to the increase in agricultural wages, and a booming real estate sector was paying higher wages to labourers.
people started leaving agriculture to work in construction. So, you know, as wages were rising in urban areas and in non-farm activity, people started working in those activities. So, the rise in wages, in real wages, was sustained by the sustained increase in employment in construction.
All this increase in incomes obviously increased consumption expenditure. The National Sample Survey Organization estimated that in the rural areas, per capita consumption expenditure pole vaulted 8.7% in 2009-12 compared to just 1.4% in 2004-9. In urban India, per capita consumption increased 6.7% compared to 2.4% in 2004-2009. But agricultural growth was stagnant at nearly 3%.
Even if you have bumper harvest, the demand is expanding much faster. Agriculture cannot grow at 100%, you know, it is growing at 4% per annum, but your fiscal deficit increased by 100% in a single year. So, when you are pumping in too much of expenditure, so there is a demand-supply gap, but not because supplies have dropped, but because you have created artificially much more demand than what the system can bear.
The rising incomes were not only increasing consumption but were also changing the food habits of Indians.
You find that last 5 years, maximum pressure is on fruits and vegetables, on protein products, dairy, meat, fish, except that in 2013-14, still there is pressure on cereals and especially on rice.
On the other hand, global petrol prices were increasing. In 2009, India was spending $49 for a barrel of crude. In 2010, the cost went up to $79. In 2011, it was $108. Between 2012 and 2014, the price hovered at around $110 per barrel.
80% of crude oil that we consume is imported. We have both current account deficit, which is depressing the value of rupee, and fiscal deficit, which is creating inflation.
The effect on the retail consumer was equally devastating. Between April 2007 and March 2014, retail petrol prices in Delhi went up from 42 rupees 85 paise per litre to 73 rupees per litre. Diesel from 30 rupees 25 paise a litre to 55 rupees per litre. Domestic cooking gas for a 14.2 kg LPG cylinder rose from 294 rupees a cylinder to 414 rupees per cylinder.
Inflation is partly imported. So oil prices in the last 7-8 years have more than doubled. In fact, it's gone up probably 3 times at one time. So when oil prices go up, for everything you use energy, right? So when you import energy inflation, it adds to inflation on a permanent basis.
Consequently, since 2010, the Indian rupee kept depreciating sharply against the US dollar. From 45.7 rupees against a dollar in 2010, it dropped to 53.4 rupees in 2012 before hitting an all-time low of nearly 70 rupees against the US dollar in 2013. Imports suddenly became costlier and India had to spend more to buy goods from abroad.
If we are not in a position to control inflation, if we do not have other exports to take care of large imports of crude oil and gas, then we should not follow a policy in which our consumption keeps on increasing and we are totally dependent on the external resources to meet the requirement.
To contain the high inflation, the RBI tried to put brakes on the money supply. It did this by increasing interest rates. After the stimulus, its first rate hike came in March 2010. Between March 2010 and October 2011, it raised the policy rates 13 times, but it failed to have any visible impact on the food inflation.
At present, there seems to be much more debate on interest rate, that is the role of monetary policy in controlling inflation. My understanding is that food inflation cannot be controlled very much by the monetary policy, right? It can have very marginal impact, but the real impact will come by controlling fiscal deficit.
Meanwhile, the RBI's high interest policy combined with other factors including global recession started to drag down economic growth. GDP growth dropped sharply from 9.2% in the fourth quarter of 2010-11 to 4.7% in the third quarter of 2013-14.
It actually becomes a double whammy. On the one hand, if you have a high inflation, it will pull down the growth. If it pulls down the growth, your income would not be rising in the same proportion in which it was rising during a high growth phase. So your income shrinks. On the other hand, because of inflation, your expenses increase. So your capacity to save actually goes down.
RBI officials, however, defend their policy by saying that interest hikes are a blunt tool. First, they slow down growth and then bring down inflation. But even the RBI admits that the slowdown in inflation is not at level with the slowdown in the economy.
You know, traditionally, monetary policy as a tool was only aimed at core inflation, which is manufactured inflation. But in India, it's got reversed. The central bank is only targeting food inflation.
But some experts say the rapid economic growth during 2003 to 2008 is itself to blame for the high inflation. This year, wholesale inflation came down to 4.6% in February, but consumer price index was at 8.1%. That's above Reserve Bank's comfort level. RBI Governor Raghuram Rajan has announced the bank's intention to continue to target inflation on the basis of retail inflation. The RBI feels economic growth can only be revived in a sustained manner by controlling inflation.
In fact, the RBI's interest rates had no impact on food inflation. So they just probably kept it high for psychological reasons.
Experts point out that the first step to control the high food inflation would of course be to improve agricultural productivity.
You need to carry out major reforms in the APMC market, because fruits and vegetables is such a phenomenon where farmer doesn't get as much as it needs to get, whereas consumer is paying more. The spread between the farmer's price and the consumer's price is very high, and you need to compress the value chains there. And that's where the role of organized retail, of the processing industry, agro-processing industry is. Only then you can bring those prices down.
To increase farm output, India needs to irrigate 30 million hectares of unirrigated land. And as an increasing number of Indians move from a cereal-based diet to a protein-rich one, it has to urgently increase the production of milk, fruit and vegetables, eggs, fish and meat. Then comes the need to invest in cold storages and supply chains to prevent wastage of perishable items. Weeding out middlemen from the supply chain is another important step to check the price rise.
Now you have a situation where you have too many middlemen who are actually skimming off. So actually the prices between the farm and the fork, meaning your dining table, actually go on increasing quite unnecessarily.
Some experts also question the government's policy of maintaining the massive stocks of food grain that distorts the market.
You are keeping 75–80 million tons. I think that's the biggest damage. You are keeping 20 to 30 million tons extra food stocks with the government. Now, when you are taking that from the market and keeping yourself without serving a purpose, then you are creating scarcity in the open market. So those prices start going up.
Now, it's only in the last few weeks that the stock has been reduced by open market operations down to 39 million tons. And this has happened only just because, you know, from the 1st of April onwards, the government, the Food Corporation of India will have to start buying grain, and that means it will procure another 20 to 30 million tons, and then the stocks will go back up to 60–70 million tons.
Fiscal consolidation is another major step. The centre can save an estimated 60,000 crore rupees annually by plugging the leakage in the food distribution network and subsidies given to the fertilizer sector.
As we have seen, inflation is the biggest talking point in this general election, and controlling high inflation is going to be the one of the toughest challenge for any new government as well. I am Krishnanand Tripathi for Rajya Sabha Television.